I think as individuals, we struggle with looking in the mirror each day, realizing there are things in our lives that are not working well, that there are choices we're making that are not producing the results that we want, that there are decisions we're making that probably aren't healthy, and so we just tend to kind of push them under the rug. Hello, everyone, and welcome to 3 Words, a bite-sized podcast about the significant and strategic choices that you can make in order to become the very best version of yourself. My name is Dr. Michael Brown. I am the host of 3 Words, and I'm here with my very good friend, Dan Costello, a frequent guest here at 3 Words, as well as a life coach with DMB Coaching. And Dan, I'm excited to have, I think, a really important conversation with you today around these 3 words.
Study your mistakes.
So let's just acknowledge right out of the gate, study your mistakes presumes that we're all making mistakes, that we are not perfect, that we are in progress, in process, and that probably, if not definitely, every single day there are mistakes that we've made, mishaps, missteps. And so I want to talk about that today. I want to lean into this conversation, not just about making mistakes, but studying the mistakes that we have made. Thoughts?
Yeah, I think before we actually, I was thinking about this, like study your mistakes. I think we do a poor job of this. I know I do a poor job of this, but before we even get to the point of studying your mistakes, we have to be able to accept our mistakes and admit our mistakes. So, I think that's the hardest thing for me is I typically, when I make a mistake, my first thought is to think about how do I blame someone else? And maybe I'm not doing it like purposely, but subconsciously, like this wasn't my fault. This was someone else's fault.
Justifying it, having a rationale for it, but not owning it.
And so I think before we can even start studying it, we have to actually say like, yeah, I messed up and I screwed something up. And I actually have a really interesting story about this. And it's so relevant to what we're going through with this pandemic right now is it was around April timeframe. And just like any company was going through a difficult time, Dana was working on a reduced work schedule for all of our staff. And so I have a team of roughly 40 people that myself and a couple other of our managers lead that team. And we were given the task to say, hey, you guys need to figure out from our top leadership. We were given the task to say, you guys need to figure out how we're going to get everything done, but on a 20% reduced work schedule. And so you guys can decide how your people work, how many hours each day, and present that out to your team and tell them what days they need to be working and what days or what hours they need to be working. So of course, our valiant team of leaders, we came together, we got our heads together like, well, just because we're in a pandemic doesn't mean that we can slack off. We need to, meet our objectives. And so let's make everybody work 5 days a week from 8 to 3 instead of 8 to 5, or we can figure out something with lunches. And so we came up with this plan and we brought everybody together. It was like I said, a team of 50 people. We brought them all together. We came up with this plan where we said, we're going to have everyone work Monday through Friday from 8 to 3. So basically you get off a couple hours early, which in the grand scheme of things, you think about it, it's like, well, no one really just like shuts off at 3 o'clock. People are going to still be working like at 4 and 5. So really, are they even going to get any benefit out of this reduced work schedule? And so we presented that to the team, and I could just see that there was distaste on the team. We were on a Teams virtual meeting. I'd see there's just like people were asking questions like what, like why, and whatnot. And so we finished that conversation, and us leaders came back together, and we actually heard that other functions had decided to take their 20% to be 1 day off a week. So you work Monday through Thursday and take Friday off. And I'm sure all the listeners are like, yeah, that makes sense. And well, we didn't think like that.
Yeah.
And so we were all together, and I guess the point of this story is we evaluated and we admitted that mistake, that we were like, okay, let's come back to the table. I don't know if we brought the team back or if we just sent an email out and said, hey, we screwed up. This wasn't the right way. This is a pandemic. People, want to feel like work isn't the most important thing in their lives right now. And so we said Friday's off, and we came back, owned our mistake, admitted it, accepted it, and pushed it back to the team and said, sorry about that, and everyone loved that because we owned it. But it could have been very easy for like, well, someone told me that we had to do that.
Yeah.
And that's why we told you that. And sorry, we miscommunicated. It was a miscommunication.
Right.
We just straight up said, we screwed up. Sorry. And this is the new plan.
And my presumption is your team will trust you more, will respect you more, and will probably be more prone to follow because you are humble leaders. And really at the very base of this conversation around mistakes, Dan, is humility.
Right.
I mean, the ability to acknowledge, to admit, you know what, I failed. And quite honestly, the way I like to talk about it in coaching is there's no such thing as failure, just losses, or there's no such thing as failure if we learn from that failure. And so in many ways, this idea of studying your mistakes, the reality is we're always making them, but we want to ignore them or we want to push past them so quickly. But to actually lean in and say, how can we make sure we don't do that again?
Yeah.
How can we learn from this? How can we put ourselves in a position where we're not replicating the mistake over and over and over again? But even as we were talking off camera with some of our friends here in the studio, there's this notion that we want to just kind of push past.
Right.
Get it behind us, move on, move forward. I guess what we're suggesting in this podcast is that we would pause, that we would actually stare at the mistake, that we would look at the mistake, that we would study the mistake and actually begin to walk around it and say, why did this happen? What can we do differently in the future? But what happens is typically at the root of this, there's so much insecurity or even shame that the mistake happened that we just want to ignore it.
Yeah.
And we want to encourage something very different, but to actually create rhythms and routines in our lives where we're actually studying and thinking about our mistakes.
And it's important that you say that, to create rhythms in our lives, because we all know that there's not enough time in the day, or at least we think there's not enough time in the day to actually set aside time to think about our mistakes, or, we can call them mistakes or we can call it like lessons learned. So I think I've spoken about this in another podcast episode, is that Dana, where I work, we have this lessons learned activity that after every program launch, we have like a list of all the things that went wrong. And the objective is, once that project is launched, we would come back together as a team and review that lessons learned list and go through it and say, hey, we screwed this up, or, this was, under budget or over budget. What can we do differently next time? And the problem is we have that list, and I'm not going to say that, we don't ever look at it, but it's probably not on our priority to say, before we start the next project, get that same team back together and look at the lessons learned, because every good company, every good person does this, right?
And companies, I think, are more prone to do this than people.
Sure.
Because I think as individuals, we struggle with looking in the mirror each day, realizing there are things in our lives that are not working well, that there are choices we're making that are not producing the results that we want, that there are decisions we're making that probably aren't healthy. And so we just tend to kind of push them under the rug and just kind of walk past them. And so it's interesting. What does it look like on a regular basis to pause in the midst of our week and actually say, what are the things in my life that aren't working? What are the mistakes that I'm making, or the challenges I'm facing, or the difficulties that I keep repeating over and over again? And just pause and say, let's study those mistakes. Let's look closely and say, what can we do differently? And I think in many ways that would help us achieve our goals and greater outcomes, because we wouldn't get so discouraged if we did that regularly. The challenge is oftentimes, and this is even when we get hired at D&B Coaching, or as we're working with individuals or companies in crisis, is we let these mistakes and these failures and these challenges all pile up on each other, and we just ignore them for so long that now we have a major issue.
Right.
But what if we just created those rhythms and those routines in our lives where we're actually pausing? For instance, I have, is a part of my life, I have Why Wednesdays. And so I like Why Wednesdays because one of the questions I ask myself on Why Wednesdays is, why am I doing the things that I'm doing?
Right.
And are they accomplishing the results that I want?
Right.
And it's not specifically focused on mistakes, but a lot of mistakes come to the surface in the midst of that
absolutely.
Self-reflection exercise.
Absolutely.
Because I'm actually wondering, the choices I'm making, the life that I'm building, is it accomplishing what I want it to be? Is it becoming who I want to be? And so just pausing to study instead of excusing, blaming for mistakes, as you talked about, pushing them off to the side, ignoring them. I'm actually encouraging you to look at that thing that might be painful.
Right.
To look at that choice that you have to acknowledge, wow, that wasn't the best. Thoughts?
Yeah. I think what also that drives is typically when you think about the mistakes that you've made, we don't make mistakes in a vacuum. Our mistakes that we make affect the people around us, right? And so when I think about the mistakes that I've made and you have that time of reflection, I bet you're not just thinking about how can I be better or how can my life be more, put together next time that I do this, but you're probably thinking about that mistake probably was offensive to that person, or that mistake probably damaged that relationship. And I know that we talk about this a lot, but everything is about relationships with me. You know what I mean? So when I think about my mistakes, I'm thinking about who did I impact that I can restore that relationship because of that mistake that I made. And if we don't have that kind of mindset, then I don't think we're really humbling ourselves to the friends and family members and coworkers that we have to actually admit our mistakes, but then say, hey, I'm not going to do that again, and I'm going to learn from that next time. You know
so admitting our mistakes, acknowledging our mistakes, I think you used the phrase appreciating our mistakes, that our mistakes are actually a gift to our growth. And in fact, you use the term mindset, and I love that idea of mindset, Dan, because I think even if you're listening into this podcast today, you probably most likely have a growth mindset. You want to grow, you want to evolve, you want to mature, you want to improve, or you'd be binging on Netflix right now, right? You would not be listening to a podcast on how to become the better version of yourself. So the fact that you're listening in means that you have a growth mindset. But you can't have a growth mindset that's effective if you are resistant to feedback, resistant to self-evaluation, resistant to personal reflection.
Right.
Beginning with mistakes.
Absolutely.
So I guess that's my encouragement, even if I can leave a challenge/encouragement for our listeners and viewers today. As strange as it may sound, I want to encourage you before the end of this day to make a list. Now, maybe your list is short. Maybe your list will be a little longer, depending on where you are in your life. But I want you to make a list of mistakes. Maybe just write down at the top of a piece of paper, mistakes that I have made or mistakes that I'm continuing to make, and actually make a list of those mistakes. And I appreciate what Dan had to say. How have those mistakes impacted others, impacted your growth, impacted your relationships? And think about, what can I learn from those mistakes? I want you, before the end of this day, even to take 10 minutes and study your mistakes. For life coaching, consulting services, or to hire a keynote speaker, please visit dmbcoaching.com.